Let me bring my own background into this for a second, because I think there's a specific point worth making about how internal fracturing inside an authoritarian government's security and military apparatus actually tends to unfold in reality, versus how it gets described by outside opposition movements with a stake in the outcome. Genuine defection and internal fracturing inside a security service under sustained external and internal pressure is a real, historically documented phenomenon. It's happened in other authoritarian collapses, but it tends to be messy, uneven, and difficult to verify from the outside, precisely because both the regime and any organized opposition have strong incentives to control the narrative around it, the regime to minimize how serious it looks, the opposition to maximize how serious it looks. That structural reality is exactly why I think the named, specific, cross-referenceable claims in this story, Shekarchi's actual public statement, Iran human rights' actual documented execution count, deserve more of your trust than the broader, harder-to-verify claims about secret defection networks and leaked private conversations. I think it's also worth connecting this back to the broader picture I've built across earlier videos on this channel about Iran's internal situation. We've covered the January 2026 crackdown, with death toll estimates ranging from just over 3,000, according to the government's own figures, to potentially tens of thousands, according to independent doctors' networks. We've covered the currency collapse, the mass protests spreading across all 31 provinces, and the internet blackout specifically used, according to Amnesty International's own direct assessment at the time, to conceal what was happening. Layer this week's reports of internal factional accusations of treason on top of that already documented picture, and even setting aside the specific unverifiable claims from NCRI and Pahlavi, you're looking at a government that's been under genuinely severe, sustained internal pressure for the better part of a year now, pressure that predates and runs entirely separate from the external military campaign we opened this video with. If you're finding this kind of careful, sourced breakdown valuable, that's exactly what I try to bring you on this channel, not just repeating whichever claim sounds most dramatic, but actually walking you through who's making each specific claim and why that matters for how much weight it deserves. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, and turn on notifications. Because between the ongoing military campaign and this internal political story, there's a lot happening inside Iran right now that deserves careful, honest coverage rather than either uncritical repetition or dismissal. Let me give you my honest read on where this actually sits. As someone who's spent a career thinking about how pressure actually breaks down an organization from the inside, whether that's a squadron, a command structure, or in this case, an entire government's security apparatus, I think the most credible part of this story is the narrowest part. A named military spokesperson publicly denouncing pro-negotiation officials, a documented execution count from an independent human rights group, and the broader economic and protest pressure I've already covered extensively on this channel. The broader, more dramatic claims, secret daily contact with large sections of the security establishment, leaked private conversations among top officials, are exactly the kind of claims that a political organization with regime change as its explicit stated goal has every incentive to present as more extensive and more certain than the underlying reality might actually support. I think it's worth applying a general rule here that I've tried to use consistently throughout this entire war's coverage on this channel, one that applies just as much to NCRI's claims about Iran as it does to Iranian state media's claims about America. The more specific, named, and independently cross-referenceable a claim is a named official, a specific date, a documented casualty count from a specialized monitoring organization, the more weight it deserves. The more diffuse, unnamed, and convenient to the source's own political goals a claim is, the more skepticism it deserves, regardless of which side of any given conflict happens to be making it. That's not a rule that favors either the Iranian government or its opposition. It's simply a consistent evidentiary standard applied evenly, and I think it's the only honest way to cover a story with this many interested parties, all trying to shape the narrative simultaneously. That said, I don't think the honest, cautious read here is that nothing is happening internally, quite the opposite. The confirmed pattern across everything I've covered on this channel, the mass protests, the executions, the currency collapse, and now this public infighting over negotiation strategy, all point toward a government under real compounding strain from multiple directions simultaneously. I just think the specific claim in your title that Iran themselves are starting to turn against the regime is more accurately described as a genuine, real, but still uncertain and unevenly documented process, rather than a confirmed decisive turning point that's already happened. I also want to leave you with a thought about why getting this specific balance right matters so much for a story like this one, more than for some of the other threads I've covered in this war. The claims of an authoritarian government's imminent internal collapse have a long, well-documented history of being both genuinely true in some historical cases and badly overstated in others. sometimes by outside observers, who mistake real but contained internal friction for a full breakdown that's still years away, or that never actually arrives at all. Getting that distinction right matters enormously for anyone trying to understand where this war and this country are actually heading, because overstating internal fragility can lead to badly miscalibrated expectations about how quickly this entire situation might resolve in either direction. I'll be tracking both threads closely, the confirmed military campaign and this harder to verify internal political story, and if there's ever independent confirmation of the more dramatic defection and mutiny claims we've discussed today, I'll bring you a dedicated update the moment that verification actually exists. If this video helped you understand both what's confirmed and what's still just a claim from an interested party, that's exactly the goal here, and I'd really appreciate you sharing it with someone else trying to follow this story honestly. Hit subscribe if you haven't, and if you want deeper access, faster answers, and priority replies during live breakdowns, whenever something major develops in this conflict, come join the Ready Room. Links in the description below. Drop your questions in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll pull the best of them into the next update as this keeps developing. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off. On July 22nd, 2026, in a prison in Karaj, Iran, a 26-year-old man named Mehdi Kanaki was executed. He was a law school graduate. He had been active in the January 2026 nationwide protests. He was arrested on February 10th, held in solitary confinement, subjected to months of physical and psychological torture, given a sham trial by the Revolutionary Court, convicted of PMOI membership and participation in the uprising, sentenced to death, and executed before most of the world noticed. On the same day, the U.S. military was conducting strikes on Iranian military targets for the 9th consecutive night. On the same night, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was publicly confirming that American projectiles had struck the under-construction Darkhovin nuclear power plant in southwestern Khuzestan province. The UN Secretary General was condemning the nuclear plant strike as a violation of international law, and in Tehran, Isfahan, Babol, Yazd, and Iraq, underground resistance networks were burning massive propaganda billboards of Iran's dead supreme leader and his son. Two things are happening in Iran simultaneously right now that together tell a story no single headline is capturing. The United States military has found a new category of target that goes deeper than any airstrike since this war began. And Iran's own population, battered by economic collapse, exhausted by the war, enraged by executions of 26-year-olds for going to protests, is beginning to turn against the only government it has ever known in the Islamic Republic era, with a fury that the regime's security apparatus is struggling to contain. This video is going to tell you both stories completely and show you why they are connected. Welcome to the channel. I am Your Name, and everything you hear in this video is verified from named credible sources. Britannica's entry on the 2026 Iranian protests, Wikipedia's sourced entry on the Iran Internal Crisis 2025 to present, Daily Sabah's confirmed reporting on Darkhovin, Iran International, which is the independent Iranian news outlet, Al Jazeera's legal analysis of infrastructure targeting, Military Times, Fox News confirmed reports including the Financial Times regime change analysis, military. Comms confirmed reporting on U.S. strikes going deeper inside Iran, Iran Human Rights, which is the Norway-based independent NGO, Reuters confirmed sourcing across multiple reports, and the NCRI, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which is an opposition organization whose execution reporting I cross-reference against the independent Iran Human Rights NGO before I cite it. I'm going to tell you when something is confirmed by independent sources, and when it comes from a side that has its own political interest in the story. That honesty is what makes this channel worth trusting. Now let us build the picture from both directions simultaneously. Start with what the United States military has found in terms of targeting, because the evolution of the U.S. strike campaign over 5 months tells a story of a military working through targets in a deliberate sequence, and now arriving at a new category that represents a fundamental escalation in what the campaign is willing to do. In the opening days of Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, the targets were military command and control, IRGC headquarters, air defense systems, naval bases, ballistic missile launchers, leadership compounds, standard high-value military targets. By mid-March, the campaign had expanded to Iranian naval assets throughout the Gulf, mine-laying vessels, coastal defense installations, surveillance towers. Then came the ballistic missile production facilities, the drone manufacturing sites, the ammunition storage, the communications infrastructure. Then the military barracks in southern Iran, including a barracks at Iranshar in the far southeast of the country, 200 kilometers from the coast. Military. Comms confirmed reporting from July 25th, sourcing Reuters and the AP, stated that 7 Iranian soldiers were killed and a dozen wounded at that Iranshar facility, and that Iranian officials confirmed the strike. Then the bridges. The road connecting Bandar Abbas to Rudan struck and closed. A bridge photographed damaged in confirmed imagery from Iran's ISNA news agency. A railway station hit. An airport targeted. Infrastructure that moves Iranian military forces and supplies toward the coast of the Strait of Hormuz. Al Jazeera's detailed July 20th analysis of civilian versus military infrastructure noted that the U.S. has escalated attacks on Iranian roads, bridges, and power plants over the past week. And then came the strike that crossed into territory that no previous attack in this war had touched. July 19th to 20th, 2026. The overnight window during the 8th consecutive night of U.S. strikes. American projectiles struck the construction site of the Darkhoven nuclear power plant in southwestern Khuzestan province, near the Iraqi border. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, the AEOI, confirmed the strike in a statement carried by Iranian state TV, describing it as an aggressive and brutal act, contrary to international law that attacked the under-construction Darkhoven nuclear power plant with a number of projectiles. Iran International confirmed the strike independently. Daily Sabah confirmed it. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, said it was investigating reports of the attack. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned it, per Fox News confirmed live war updates from July the 20th. And Iran's government called it a violation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which include a specific prohibition on attacking nuclear power generation plants, regardless of military context, per Al Jazeera's legal analysis. This was not a weapons facility. Darkhoven is a civilian nuclear power plant under construction. The United States government has not confirmed the strike. But the targets around Darkhoven, the Khuzestan province military installations, the road and bridge network in the region, the IRGC logistics infrastructure in southwestern Iran, were all part of the confirmed strike campaign. And if this was the U.S., the strategic logic is clear. Darkhoven, if completed, would eventually reduce Iran's dependence on oil revenue for electricity generation by adding domestic nuclear-generated power to the grid. More electricity from nuclear means more oil to sell. Hitting the construction site delays that future revenue diversification. It also sends a message about how far into Iranian civilian infrastructure this campaign is now willing to go if talks do not produce results. Before we get to Trump's explicit threats about energy infrastructure, I want to give you the full legal and strategic context of what hitting a nuclear power plant construction site actually means in the 2026 war. Because the international legal dimension here changes how every government in the world reads this conflict. Al Jazeera's July the 20th analysis is the clearest breakdown of this. The 1949 Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols of 1977 prohibit attacks on nuclear power generation plants, even when they are near military objectives. The treaty is explicit. Iran's AEOI called the Darkhoven strike a clear violation of international law. The IAEA said it was investigating. Russia condemned it. UN Secretary General Guterres condemned it. And the United States has not confirmed it. That legal ambiguity is itself deliberate. If the U.S. did strike Darkhoven, doing so without official confirmation allows Washington to avoid an official international law confrontation, while Iran absorbs the physical consequences. If it was not confirmed U.S. ordnance, the attribution question creates additional uncertainty that serves American strategic interests. The strategic logic of hitting Darkhoven, legal questions aside, is this. A completed Darkhoven nuclear power plant would eventually provide Iran with domestically generated electricity that reduces its need to burn oil and gas for domestic power. More oil freed from domestic electricity generation means more oil available for export and revenue. Hitting Darkhoven delays that future revenue diversification. More immediately, it sends a signal to the Iranian government that no facility, regardless of its civilian purpose, international legal protection, or international supervision status, is off the table if this war continues on Iran's current terms. That signal is the intended message. The target itself matters less than what hitting it communicates about how far Washington is willing to go. And here is the number that ties this escalation to the internal story in Iran. The Iranian people are not just watching their government lose the military campaign. They are watching their electricity grid come under pressure, their water infrastructure get hit, their bridges close, and their government announce it will respond with more attacks on Gulf state infrastructure. Every action the Iranian government takes in this war has consequences that land first on ordinary Iranian civilians. And those civilians have been in the streets. The Trump administration has been explicit about the escalation framework. Military Times confirmed reporting from Reuters in which Trump stated, and I am quoting him directly, "I'll save the energy targets for last, but ultimately we'll hit energy targets." In a Fox News interview, he was even more specific. Next week comes the power plants. Next week comes the bridges. We are going to knock out all their power plants and all their bridges unless they get to the table and negotiate. Trump made those statements in mid-July. The bridge strikes happened. The Darkovan nuclear plant site was hit. The energy target's threat remains explicitly on the table. And the Financial Times, confirmed by Fox News live updates on July the 20th, reported that elements of the Trump administration are once again flirting with what they called Plan A, which is to topple the Iranian regime, and that efforts to encourage an internal uprising in Iran are back on Washington's agenda. The regime change option, which had been set aside in favor of the nuclear deal negotiations, is being discussed again inside the administration. Not because diplomacy is completely abandoned, but because the combination of the military campaign and the internal pressure within Iran is producing dynamics that some officials believe could be amplified. Subscribe to this channel right now before we go into the internal Iran story, because this is where the reporting gets most complex and where you most need a source that is going to tell you exactly where each fact comes from and what its limitations are. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I cover this conflict at this level every time there is a significant development, and I will not cut corners on sourcing to make the story sound cleaner than it is. If you are already subscribed, thank you. If you are not, do it now. This next section is the part of the story that almost nobody in Western coverage is giving enough attention to. Before February 28th, 2026, before Operation Epic Fury, before the Strait of Hormuz was closed and Khamenei was killed, Iran was already in a state of serious internal crisis. Britannica's confirmed entry on the 2026 Iranian protest documents that protests erupted in Tehran on December 28, 2025, initially led by bazaar merchants and shopkeepers. They spread across the country within days. Chants of death to the dictator appeared in cities across Iran. Britannica describes these protests as the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since the woman, life, freedom movement in 2022 and 2023. On January 8, 2026, Iranian security forces launched a crackdown that some observers compared in its scale and brutality to mass atrocity events. Wikipedia's sourced Iran internal crisis entry confirms that since 2025, these economic and political protests had been building into the most sustained domestic challenge the regime had faced in years. Trump threatened to intervene if protesters were killed. He ultimately did not act after the crackdown temporarily suppressed the visible protests. But the nature of that crackdown deserves to be described fully because it is the direct context for the executions that are now happening. Britannica describes the January 8, 2026 crackdown as so brutal that some observers use the phrase Iran's Babi Yar to describe its scale, referencing the World War II massacre in Ukraine. Security forces used live fire against crowds. Mass arrests targeted protest organizers, online commentators, and anyone identified as having played a leadership role. The regime's revolutionary court processed thousands of cases rapidly. Charges of mohareba, which translates as waging war against God, and efsad felars, meaning corruption on earth, were applied to protesters by the hundreds. These are charges that carry the death penalty in the Islamic Republic's legal system. They are charges that have been used consistently by the regime to execute political opponents by framing dissent as a religious and cosmic offense rather than a political disagreement. The logic of this framing is deliberate. If you are a protester charged with waging war against God, you are not a citizen with grievances. You are a criminal against the divine order. And the execution of such a person is not political repression. It is justice, according to the system's own framework. Most of the world called it something different. The January 2026 crackdown was followed by the February 28th launch of Operation Epic Fury. And the regime, now at war externally, used the war to continue the judicial processing of the January arrests at an accelerating pace. Court appearances were rushed. Verdicts were predetermined. Sentences were handed down in sessions that lasted hours rather than days. And execution dates were being set for people who had been arrested just months earlier. Trump threatened to intervene if protesters were killed. He ultimately did not act after the crackdown temporarily suppressed the visible protests. But the February 28th launch of Operation Epic Fury came just 7 weeks after that January 8th crackdown. The Iranian government was already governing a population that had just been brutally suppressed when the war began. And then it used the war to tighten the grip further. Here is what the Iranian regime did once Operation Epic Fury began, and this is confirmed by multiple independent sources. The NCRI, which is opposition affiliated and whose claims I verify against independent sources, reported that under cover of the war, thousands of young protesters were arrested, large numbers of participants in the January uprising were executed, and 10 PMOI members were executed since the war began. The IRGC and Basij forces have remained deployed in the streets of Iranian cities for months to prevent new protests. The Iranian parliament, the Majlis, was suspended during the war to prevent internal factional divisions from becoming publicly visible. Iran Human Rights, the Norway-based independent NGO that is not affiliated with any Iranian political faction, has confirmed independently that the number of people put to death in direct connection with the January 2026 uprising has now reached 24. Iran Human Rights does not have a political interest in inflating that number. They count confirmed executions with named individuals. 24 people executed specifically for participating in protests against the Iranian government. And on July 22nd, 2026, the 25th name was added. Mehdi Khanaki, 26 years old, law school graduate from Karaj. He participated in the January protests. He was arrested February 10th. He was held in Evin prison and then in Gezel Hisar prison in solitary confinement for 7 months, subjected to severe physical and psychological torture per the NCRI reporting, corroborated by Iran International. The regime used what Iran International described as a sham trial in the Revolutionary Court. He was convicted of PMOI membership and active participation in the January uprising. His sentence was death and confiscation of all his property. He was executed at dawn on July the 22nd, 2026. He was 26 years old and had been arrested for going to a protest. Iran International confirmed his execution independently of the NCRI. The Norway-based Iran Human Rights included him in their confirmed count. His name was Mehdi Khanaki. He was a law student who believed in something enough to go into the street for it. The Iranian regime's calculation in accelerating executions is straightforward in a brutal political logic. Fear is the tool. If you execute enough people who went to protests, the calculation goes, the next generation of potential protesters will weigh the cost differently. It has worked before. The 2009 Green Movement was suppressed. The 2019 protests were suppressed. The 2022 Woman, Life, Freedom Movement was suppressed. The January 2026 uprising was suppressed. Each time, the regime reached for harder tools, and the protests subsided. But the conditions that generate protests have not subsided. They have gotten catastrophically worse during this war. Iran's oil exports have been cut to a fraction of their pre-war levels by the U.S. naval blockade. The rial has continued losing value against the dollar. Food prices and fuel prices have continued rising. Workers and retirees who depend on government-funded institutions and pension systems are seeing delayed and reduced payments as the government's revenue base collapses. During the last week of July 2026, per the NCRI reporting cross-referenced against Iran International, demonstrations continued across Iran as retirees, workers, housing applicants, and other social groups protested worsening economic conditions, inflation, and corruption. Not political demonstrations, economic demonstrations. People who cannot afford to feed their families and cannot pay rent and have watched their life savings depreciate into almost nothing, who are going into the streets and saying so, even while the Basij is deployed and the execution announcements are being read on state media. And, simultaneously, in cities across the country during the week of July 11th through 18th, per the NCRI reporting, which I am citing as opposition-sourced, but noting it correlates with reported ground conditions from Iran. International, coordinated underground resistance networks launched 40 synchronized anti-regime operations. In Tehran, Isfahan, Babol, Yazd, and Iraq, activists torched massive propaganda billboards of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the Islamic Republic's founder, of Ali Khamenei, the dead supreme leader of Mojtaba Khamenei, who has been controversially elevated as Khamenei's successor, and of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC commander killed by the US in 2020. Burning a propaganda billboard in Iran is not a small act of symbolic protest. It is a direct physical attack on the regime's public authority in a country where such acts have historically been met with imprisonment or death. These were not spontaneous individual actions. 40 coordinated operations in multiple cities in 1 week. The people doing this know what the punishment is. They did it anyway. Let me give you the full picture of what 40 coordinated operations in 1 week actually means in practical terms, because the number sounds abstract until you understand the risk involved and what it takes to execute that kind of distributed campaign inside a police state that has Basij forces deployed in the streets and IRGC intelligence units actively hunting organizers. These are not people standing in a square with signs. These are people who move in small cells, who communicate through encrypted channels, who have memorized operational security protocols developed over years, who scout a location, carry accelerants to a propaganda billboard that may be on a main road in a city, set it alight, and disappear before security forces can respond. 40 of these operations in different cities simultaneously means 40 separate cell units operating independently with no central coordination point that, if captured, could expose the others. The distributed cell structure is designed specifically to survive against the kind of intelligence penetration the IRGC routinely uses, and the choice of targets is significant. They are not burning factories or government offices. They are burning the faces of the regime's foundational figures: Khomeini, Khamenei, Mojtaba Khamenei, Soleimani. These are billboards that exist across Iranian cities as constant visual reminders of who holds authority and what that authority is rooted in. Setting them on fire is an act of symbolic regime negation. We reject the faces you have put on every street to tell us who to obey. The fact that this is happening in multiple cities simultaneously, in the same week that Mehdi Kanaki was executed for doing far less, tells you that the executions are not producing the deterrence effect the regime is counting on. The NCRI report states this directly, and it is confirmed by the continued operational pace. Rather than breeding fear, the regime's brutality is only strengthening the resolve of Iran's rebellious youth. Whether that assessment from an opposition organization proves accurate will be one of the defining questions of this conflict's next phase. The people doing this know what the punishment is. They did it anyway. Here's the piece of the internal Iran story that changes the strategic calculation most significantly, and it comes from confirmed reporting in the Financial Times cited by Fox News: the contested succession. When Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening salvo of Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, Iran faced a succession crisis that it had been officially pretending would not happen. Khamenei had held the position of supreme leader since 1989, 37 years. He had never formally designated a successor. The Assembly of Experts, the body responsible for selecting a supreme leader, moved to elevate Mojtaba Khamenei, his son, to the position. Mojtaba Khamenei has a far lower public profile than his father and considerably less religious credibility within the clerical establishment. Wikipedia's Iran internal crisis entry documents that the contested elevation of his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, and the internal power struggles following Khamenei's death have created a deepening political crisis for the clerical establishment. Some senior clerics have publicly questioned the religious legitimacy of dynastic succession in a system based on the principle of velayat-e-faqih, rule by the Islamic jurist. The NCRI, whose analysis on this point aligns with independent observers, describes an internal power vacuum. The regime is attempting to project unified authority while managing the reality that the figure who provided that unifying authority for 37 years is dead, and his replacement's legitimacy is contested within the very system that elevated him. There is one more dimension of the internal Iran crisis that I want you to understand before we get to the Trump administration's calculation, because it is the piece of the story that changes the long-term trajectory of the regime, regardless of what happens militarily in the Strait of Hormuz: the succession crisis. When Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed on February 28th, the Assembly of Experts moved to elevate his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new supreme leader. On the surface, this looks like a continuity of authority. It is not. The Islamic Republic's foundational ideology, velayat-e-faqih, rule of the Islamic jurist, requires that the supreme leader hold genuine religious authority. Mojtaba Khamenei has a lower clerical rank than several other senior figures in the Iranian religious hierarchy. Senior grand ayatollahs, whose religious authority and scholarly credentials exceed Mojtaba's, have not publicly endorsed his elevation. Some have raised questions about whether dynastic succession is even compatible with the system's own theological principles. A supreme leader whose position is contested within the clerical establishment that is supposed to legitimate his authority faces a different kind of governance challenge than a leader who holds that authority uncontested. And this is happening simultaneously with a war being lost, a naval blockade starving the economy, protests in the streets, and executions accelerating. The internal power struggle is not visible to cameras, but it is real. Wikipedia's Iran internal crisis entry documents the contested elevation and the internal power struggles within the ruling hierarchy, following Khamenei's death, as an established fact, not speculation. The regime is managing its own succession crisis while doing everything else it is trying to do right now. And the United States appears to believe this combination is exploitable. What the Trump administration appears to see in this combination, per the Financial Times reporting confirmed by Fox News, is an opportunity. A government that is simultaneously losing the external military campaign, losing the economic foundation of its authority, executing protesters in accelerating numbers, managing a contested succession, and watching 40 coordinated anti-regime operations burn propaganda billboards in its major cities, is a government under compound pressure from multiple directions. The Financial Times' direct quote from U.S. administration-linked officials is that elements of the Trump administration are once again flirting with Plan A, which is to topple the Iranian regime, and that efforts to encourage internal uprising are back on Washington's agenda. This does not mean Washington is actively organizing or funding the resistance operations currently happening inside Iran. There is no confirmed evidence of direct U.S. operational involvement in domestic Iranian resistance. But it means the administration is watching the internal situation with interest and is calculating whether the external military and economic pressure can be calibrated to amplify what is already happening from inside. Let me give you my honest assessment of what this combination of pressures actually means for where this conflict goes from here, because I want to be clear about what is confirmed, what is uncertain, and what remains genuinely unpredictable. What is confirmed is this. The US military is striking deeper inside Iran with each passing week, now hitting infrastructure that affects civilian life, a nuclear power plant construction site, and military logistics networks 200 kilometers from the coast. This represents a deliberate escalation of the target set. Iran's government is simultaneously managing an external military campaign. It is losing on every conventional metric in an internal political situation that is more unstable than at any point in the Islamic Republic's history. The economic blockade is real, the revenue loss is confirmed, and the domestic economic pressure on ordinary Iranians is documented by demonstrations happening in real time right now. And 24 people, no, 25 with Mehdi Kanaki, have been executed specifically for participating in protests. What is uncertain is whether this combination of pressures is enough to produce the outcome the Trump administration wants. And I want to give you the honest historical counterpoint here because this channel is built on not telling you only what confirms the dominant narrative. Iran has survived compound crisis before. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, the country sustained 8 years of devastating conflict, international isolation, chemical weapons attacks against its own Kurdish population by Iraq, the loss of hundreds of thousands of military personnel, economic devastation from an oil war that destroyed tankers moving Iranian crude, and a population that was exhausted, grieving, and economically broken. And the regime survived. After the war, Khomeini's death in 1989 created a succession crisis that elevated the relatively junior Ali Khamenei to the supreme leader position over the objections of more senior clerics who believed his religious authority was insufficient. Sound familiar? The regime survived that contested succession too. Sanctions in the 2010s, designed explicitly by the Obama administration to create enough economic pressure to bring Iran to nuclear negotiations, produced significant hardship, and the nuclear deal of 2015 as a negotiated outcome, but not regime change. The regime adapted and survived. What the advocates of the regime change scenario in the Trump administration and in the Iranian resistance community would argue is that none of those previous crises combined this many simultaneous pressures at this severity level. A dead supreme leader, a contested succession, 85% of the defense industrial base destroyed, the entire Navy sunk, the nuclear program severely damaged, a naval blockade costing $500 million per day, domestic executions accelerating the resistance rather than suppressing it. The argument is that the compound nature of this crisis is qualitatively different from what the regime has survived before. Whether that argument is correct is something that no analysis, however thorough, can definitively answer in advance. History will answer it. We are watching it happen. What is uncertain is whether this combination of pressures is enough to produce the outcome the Trump administration wants. The history of authoritarian governments facing combined external military pressure and internal economic stress does not produce a simple, predictable outcome. Some regimes collapse. Some dig in and survive by becoming more repressive and finding ways to generate enough internal economic relief to maintain a functional political coalition. The Iranian government has survived significant external pressure before. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years and killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians, and the regime survived it. Sanctions during the nuclear program years were severe, and the regime survived them. What it has not previously faced is the combination of this many pressures simultaneously, with this much of its military capacity destroyed, with the scale of revenue loss, and with its foundational leader dead and his successor contested. The most honest answer to where this goes is that it depends on which pressure breaks something first. If the executions of protesters produce more resistance rather than less, if Mehdi Kanaki becomes a name that mobilizes rather than silences, if the 40 coordinated operations in 1 week become 400, the internal dimension could accelerate in ways that compound the external military situation beyond the regime's ability to manage. If diplomacy in Doha and Oman produces an agreement that allows oil revenue to restart, the internal economic pressure reduces and the regime buys time to reconsolidate. Right now, both possibilities are live. Both trajectories are in motion simultaneously. If you want to understand this conflict at this level, every time there is a significant verified development, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. I am here every time something major moves, sourcing every claim, naming every source, giving you the counterpoints as well as the main argument. Leave your honest read in the comments below. Do you think the combination of external military pressure and internal popular resistance is enough to break the Islamic Republic? Or does this regime find a way to survive both simultaneously the way it has survived every other challenge in its history? Drop your read below, share this video with someone who is trying to make sense of what is happening inside Iran right now, because this internal story is the one that most English language coverage is underreporting, and it is the one that may matter most in the end. Every name in this video is real. Every source is named. Mehdi Kanaki was 26 years old. This is your name. Mehdi Kanaki's name deserves to be remembered. Stay sharp.